So our first video on biology looks at the basic building blocks of life. They're structures called cells, and we need to be able to label a very basic cell, be able to draw one as well, and know what the different structures do in them. The different structures are called organelles, but they've all got specific names as well. So the outer line of it is a barrier, if you like, between outside the cell and inside the cell. It's called the cell membrane. It's not a very strong structure, so it's not rigid, but it does control the movement into and out of the cell. So if you're ever asked for the function or the job of the cell membrane, is to control movement into and out. And that can be very important because to get nutrients in or waste product out, it's the job of the cell membrane. Inside the cell, you've got a gel-like substance that fills it. It's not just water, and it's called cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is often dismissed because we don't actually draw a specific structure for it, but it contains nutrients, it contains special chemicals or proteins called enzymes that allow it to carry out reactions such as respiration, very important one that produces energy. So the cytoplasm can be just as vital as any other organelle. These tiny structures, sometimes drawn with a more sausage shape to them, but this is GCSE, so you might see a basic one like this. They're called mitochondria. Mitochondria have one of the most vital jobs. It's that they produce energy. Now to do that, they carry out a reaction, a chemical reaction called respiration. And in that chemical reaction, it releases energy, and then the cell can use that energy to do whatever job it needs. So if we're asked for the function of the mitochondria, it's to carry out respiration and produce energy as a result. The last little structure we have to label here, which is the biggest one of all, I suppose excluding the cytoplasm, is the nucleus. The nucleus is kind of like the control point of the cell. It contains a special molecule you've probably heard of called DNA, and that DNA codes for what basically makes us up, who we are. It'll be the nucleus that controls the cell and tells it what to do, because that determines the way we are structured, the way we look, and so on. So the four organelles: cell membrane to control movement into and out of the cell, the cytoplasm that contains enzymes to carry out reactions and nutrients, the mitochondria to carry out respiration and produce energy, and then the nucleus, which controls the cell. However, plant cells are different to animal cells, so you have to be able to label a plant cell as well. In this case, we've labelled the cytoplasm, the nucleus, and the cell membrane, but be careful with labelling the cell membrane in a plant cell. It'll be the inner line of the this big thick outer layer, and I'll explain why in a minute. This is actually not too good a line for labeling it, because there's a square on the end, when really you want the line to go and just touch the inner line of this thick layer here. So as well as that, we have little structures which are a little bit bigger than mitochondria and not so sausage shaped. They'd be more oval shaped, and sometimes they're drawn as green if it's not a black and white diagram, and that's because they contain a green substance called chlorophyll. Now they're chloroplasts. Their name is chloroplasts, and this chlorophyll allows them to absorb light, and that is what allows them to carry out photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a reaction that allows them to produce nutrients. So a plant doesn't get most of its nutrients from eating like we do. Instead, it absorbs light. The chlorophyll absorbs light inside the chloroplast. It carries out photosynthesis, and that produces nutrients. So the chemical reactions going on to produce nutrients. The biggest organelle inside the plant cell is a huge structure called a vacuole. A vacuole is just basically a big bubble inside the cell, and it's used for storage of nutrients. And now this is the reason why we had to be careful with labeling the cell membrane, because the outer layer on a plant is called the cell wall. So be careful not to mix up the two. It's a big difference because the cell wall has a rigid structure. It gives structure to the cell, and also it can't control any movement through it. Molecules just freely move through it. I always compare it to like the straws in Kaplunk, if you've ever played it. It's quite an old game now perhaps, where there's a mesh of straws and marbles try to fall through it. Well, the straws, taking enough straws out, and although there's a mass of straws there, the marbles can quite easily fall through, and that's kind of what a cell wall is. It's just this big mesh of fibers, but molecules can simply pass between the gaps. So in a plant cell, as well as the ones we have in an animal cell, don't take those out, we've got the chloroplasts that carry out photosynthesis to produce nutrients, the vacuole to store energy, and the cell wall, which adds structure to the cell. Should note as well that they do have mitochondria, so although they're not in this diagram, you would draw mitochondria in if you were talking about a plant cell. Cells have to what we call differentiate, in that what that means is that they specialize to become particular types of cells. So here we've got stem cells, which are just bog standard cells, kind of like the ones we draw if you were asked to make a diagram, like the ones I just shown you. But when you are developing as a baby, or as an embryo I should say, they will start to become different types of cells, and they become what makes us up. So for example, here they might become long and thin, so they're changing their shape, and become muscle cells. They might get a really what we call a biconcave shape. What that means is have a little dip in the center and become blood cells, like these ones down here. It's not just their shape that changes, but also the structures they have. So because a muscle cell needs a lot of energy, it makes more mitochondria. Because the blood cells want more room to carry oxygen, they get rid of the nucleus. So two things that change in this cell differentiation, or also known as cell specialization: the shape changes and the number or type of organelles they have changes. Now, cells will work together, or identical cells will work together to form tissue, because we're not just made up of any old cells. We have to have it in such a structured way that makes up an organism. So groups of identical cells actually work together to perform a job, and that's what we call that a tissue. Different tissues will then work together to form an organ. So for example, in the heart, we have muscle tissue, we have nervous tissue, we have what we call adipose tissue or fatty tissue, and all of those work together to form the heart, which is an organ. In this case, the stomach would have muscle tissue, it would have epithelial tissue, which is like a lining. When you've got different organs working together to perform a function or functions, it forms a system. So the stomach, which is an organ, is part of the digestive system, where you've got the intestine, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver. They're all part of the digestive system, or doing jobs in the digestive system. And then when you've got a number of systems working together, that will produce an organism. So have a try at some of these questions, pause them, and we'll see if we can get them right. So the mitochondria carries out respiration, that's producing energy. The nucleus controls the cell. Cytoplasm contains those enzymes and nutrients. The chloroplast carries out photosynthesis, and the cell membrane controls movement into and out of the cell. The three organelles that plant cells have that animals don't are the chloroplasts, the vacuoles, and the cell walls. The size of a cell might change, the shape of it might change, the size of it might change, the shape of it might change, and the organelles that they have might change. The tissue is a group of identical cells working together to carry out a function, and then when you've got groups of organs working together, you've got a system.